Joining us now is good friend Chuck Rocha. Chuck, you may have seen all over the interwebs and all over television. Chuck used to work for people like Bernie Sanders. He was the United Steelworkers political director back in the day. But Chuck is a Texan, you may notice from the hat. He's like legitimately behind the hat. Like he deserves the hat. He's a Texan, but he's somebody who really understands what's happening with Latinos in the United States, with the broad spectrum of political issues that are happening in the country. And we're just excited to have him right here with us on Trailblaze. He's a trailblazer. Chuck, welcome.
Man, is it good to be here. Congratulations to both of you. This is really exciting. I love the podcast. I love what y'all are doing.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. All right. So, Chuck, we're just going to dive right in. So here's the question that we're all facing. All right. America's changing. We all know that. Back when you and I first got started in politics, because we're a little older than that era. Back when you and I first got started in politics, swing voters were always these suburbanites, right? They were white suburbanites, white women in the suburbs. What are they going to do on election day? Now, joining those key swing voters, we all start talking about African-American men. We're talking about young people, and we're talking about Latinos. As you survey the country and what you're working on, just tell us, what's happening in the country, and are we actually going to swing these voters toward the Democrats this year?
I think what you're witnessing, over time is you're seeing a vote that is maturing. And what I mean by maturing is that you can't say that we're getting real mature. If you listen to my podcast, the Latino Vote podcast, or about me for more than 10 minutes, I'm still not that mature. But the voters themselves are getting a lot more mature. The average age of a Latino voter in America is 27. You got to start there for all of you professionals who love this podcast that are nerds like us three. You got to understand that when you say, well, Latino voters are not performing at the same level as black voters or white voters. And I'm like, yeah, because the average age of those two voters are 40, for God's sakes. And if you just look on the voter file, a 40-year-old votes a lot more often than a 27-year-old. So you start there. The second big thing that's changing is 15 or 20 years ago, about 18 years ago, the majority of Latino voters were foreign born. Guess what the majority of Latino voters are now? They're second generation, they're third generation. They're the kids and the grandkids of people that sacrificed a lot to get to this country for the American dream. And their kids and their grandkids act a little bit differently. There's not been a swing to the Republican Party in any way. But what you've been seeing is a soft siphoning off, especially under Donald Trump, of folks that are what I call Republican curious, especially a bunch of Latino men. So you just see a vote that's acting a lot differently. And to your point, Jamal, is getting a lot more persuasive, where you need to spend more time and energy to explain to a newer, younger, infrequent voter what you're going to do to help them.
Chuck, there's always this idea of explaining the Latino vote to everybody else and saying, well, it's not a monolith. You have to understand the diversity. And we get it. I want to get past that and get deeper, because there are certain things that, as you mentioned, this generational shift that are different, and that may actually help connect some dots about why messages about Democrats are communists, Kamala's a communist, why those actually work in some of these demographics.
Because we come from so many different places. If we level set here, you should know, and all your viewers should know, that about 63% of all Latinos in the country are Mexican American or come from Mexican American descent. But also 75% of all the Latino voters in America do not live in a battleground state. They will not hear from Kamala Harris, and they will not hear from Donald Trump. Now, they'll see stuff on their crazy uncle's Facebook about Donald Trump, like you said, or they'll hear something from their cousin who said it's communist Kamala or some crazy shit. But the regular voters will not have any information from a presidential campaign, because most of our population live in Texas, Florida, California, New York, and Illinois. 75% of all Latinos live there. There'll be not a dollar spent. But if you think about beyond the Mexican-American experience, it's the Latinos that live in battleground states. Let's just look at Pennsylvania. Yeah, most of the Latinos in Pennsylvania are Dominican and Puerto Rican. And Dominican and Puerto Ricans have a much different immigrant experience. They're U.S. citizens. Most of the folks in Pennsylvania actually moved from New York and New Jersey to escape high taxes. And then there was a whole climate emergency with a hurricane on the island that forced a lot of Puerto Ricans, over 100,000 of them, to move to Pennsylvania to live with relatives. So it's such a dynamic diaspora of not only is it from different regions of the country, you have all these Venezuelans and Colombians that have moved in, but even amongst Mexican-American voters, you have Mexicans like me with a cowboy hat from Texas who act much different than the Mexican from East LA. So you need a lot of time and effort to break apart these subsections of our voters.
All right, so that's a great point you just made. So let's talk about Pennsylvania, because that's the place obviously everybody's paying attention to. We talk about the blue wall. We talk about what's happening in the battleground states. Are you seeing a difference among Latinos in Pennsylvania in terms of how they're performing for the Democrats versus Republicans versus the national numbers? You think, are they overperforming in Pennsylvania? Are they at like the historic number, or are they lower?
Trump has been a phenomenon within the Latino voter segment, even in Pennsylvania, where these particular Latinos who are Puerto Rican are some of the most steadfast Democrats. And you know why? A, it's cultural, but B, they moved from New York and New Jersey. And guess what they were in New York and New Jersey? They were Democrats.
Right.
And their parents were Democrats. But what you've seen is them underperforming historic numbers in those areas as new Puerto Ricans and Dominicans have moved in there. And what you see is their kids and their grandkids. And folks are like, well, look, they're coming of age and they're voting Republican. Well, some of them are so left, they don't think the Democratic Party, a la Bernie Sanders, a lot of them are being lost to third party folks who they care a lot about what's going on in Gaza and Israel that we don't talk about because it's such a nuanced demographic.
You talk about the nuance of the demographic, but you're also involved in trying to target and message and literally help candidates speak to these communities. So how do you actually manage to do that? Are there some common threads for this younger generation, right? Because there is a difference between folks, immigrants from the 80s and 90s versus the 27-year-old voter you're talking about now.
Well, I think the big thing is that because of the world that we live in now, that's much different than when me and Jamal had hair and were young men working in this field. We only had 3 TV stations. It was much easier to get to them. So now we spend $2 billion, and there will be $2 billion spent on TV, radio, and digital this cycle. Be a lot of media consultants buying a third home in the rural parts of North Carolina. But anyway,
I hope you're one of them.
Not Chuck. No, Chuck is a man of the people.
That's right. I'm here in my little row house in Capitol Hill. But what I'm getting at there is that because the channels have been spread out, it's not as much about messaging. It's about figuring out a tactic to get to those folks and give them a message, because while they're watching TV, even if they have a TV, even if they have cable, most of them don't. They're scrolling on TikTok and they're getting so much of their information from TikTok and some from Instagram Reels and some from some other. These younger folks are on TikTok, whether you like TikTok or not. If you're not having a presence on TikTok, you're missing out this younger generation. The biggest difference in political campaigns from today to not even 6 years ago is when we saw voters who would go in and do a search for a candidate or an issue, they would leave a platform that they're on and go to Google and search. The biggest difference now is these young people search on platform. So they're searching on Instagram and they're searching way more on TikTok to get information about Kamala Harris or about Joe Biden or about whoever that may be. It's the biggest misstep of how we're not getting to these younger folks is because A, you can't advertise per se on TikTok. So folks are trying to buy influencers and have influencers say good things about them who support them. So it becomes more cumbersome. Is it enough return on the dollar? What does that mean in a points buy? Like all of your nerdy friends who are watching this podcast get that piece, but that's how they're missing this younger demographic. It's not because they're messaging to them wrong. It's just harder to get to them.
Let's say just for a quick second, Jamal, follow up there, because that whole paying influencers was blew up as part of a negative Trump campaign story when we find out so many of these bro influencers were receiving money from Russia, that ostensibly they were giving pro-Russia and pro-Trump messaging. And we've seen a lot of effort from the Trump campaign to reach men, including men of all different demographics, on TikTok, on these places. So, is there an idea now of like the ideal Latino influencer, or is it far more broken out than that?
What we're looking at is micro influencers in states. Because we're only spending money in a certain amount of states, you can look on the platform and figure out who is the Latino influencer in North Carolina. What are they doing? What are they talking about? And figure out by looking at their feed for 2 seconds, are they pro-immigrant? Are they pro-environment? Are they pro-Kamala Harris? And then you start building a relationship with them to then use them to get out to their followers, to be a conduit to their followers pretty much in that realm. And that's the biggest difference, is this new terminology that's called micro influencers. You two are probably micro influencers and you don't even know it.
Yes. Yeah. Well, we know you're a micro influencer, Chuck. Listen, here, I guess this is the bottom line of this that I really want to get at. This conversation about losing Latinos, is there something really, I know that there's an age difference. I know that there's a demographic, from country of origin difference. I know there's a geographic difference. But we are certainly seeing that Democrats have trouble with men. We've always talked about white men. But it seems to me this thing about men is not just about white men now. We're seeing it with African-American men. I think we're seeing it with Latino men. How do the Democrats communicate across this gender divide in a way that's compelling to get men to see themselves in the aspirations of the Democratic Party?
The reason I'm chomping at the bit to answer that is, and you see my eye twitching, is because I live with it every day. I'm a much different consultant, not just because of this stupid cowboy hat, than most of the consultants in this world that we live in. I never went to college. I was a teenage father who I raised and had my boy for his whole life. He's 35 now, and I got 2 beautiful grandkids. And I tell you, and I have a criminal record. Any one of those 3 things would have kept me out of politics.
Mm-hmm,
but I have all 3 of them, and I am one of the most successful political consultants, thank God, in this town. Sir. And the reason I tell you that is there's a lot of Latino men, there's a lot of young black men who have come of age, who have, you can serve them all the abortion spots about Dobbs that you want to, but you're not speaking to them about things that are particularly important to that man. I'm very pro-choice. I'm very anti the Dobbs decision. I am lock, stock, and barrel with my sister saying should be as important to me as them. But when you go down to the voter and what you're talking about, Jamal, it's the piece that I keep telling Democrats of why I joined the party. I was a union Democrat back in the day, and I joined the party because I was tired of seeing our jobs sent overseas. My factory was shut down. They sent my tire factory overseas. I worked in that factory. I joined it because I was tired of there being so much money and influence by rich people and regular folks not having a say in campaigns. You could say, drain the swamp. You could say that I wanted to put America first. I wanted to see our folks in this place taken care of, like all those men who had, including my father, and 6 of my uncles who had lost their job at that tire factory. Now, What I just described is a lot of what Donald Trump is using. He don't believe in none of it, but he uses it to siphon off what we call non-college educated white men or non-college educated voters. Well, it just so happens that the biggest growth percentage of non-college blue-collar workers are Latino men. 1 in 5 Latino men are tied to the housing industry. They're either building houses, they're pouring concrete, they're roofers, they're landscapers. 1 in 5, that's a lot. So that's when you saw the COVID thing happen and folks saying, we got to get this back open. We got to get people back to work because that over-indexed. When Democrats say, Chuck, stop all the hollering and all the spitting at me. Tell me what's the one thing I could do as a Democrat, if they're listening to me to begin with, to get these men back. And I say, use an economic populist message, the one I used for Bernie Sanders, for example, that over-indexed and had Latino men and women voting for him at large number. But root your narrative in the sanctity of work. There's one thing that we all have to do, and we all have to work. Now, you can say, well, women work too. Absolutely. And by God, they work harder than men. But if you want to talk about messaging to men, talk to them about what it's like in the day of a worker to have to work and honor that work. And when I do a commercial, I say that work doesn't matter if you have to take a shower after you're done or you're putting on a suit and tie and you're taking a shower before you go. If you're a doctor or a lawyer or you're picking peas in a field somewhere, work is work, and we got to have work to do what? Provide for our family and make sure that our kids, our wife, our partner has everything that they need. That's the root of the comms.
Yeah. Hold on, Naomi. I had a conversation with a Republican consultant about this, and he said to me, I'm going to be a little bit crass. He said, so let me just tell you drive down the street, you see a road crew on the side of the street, on the side of the highway. Who do you see in that road crew? You see some Latino guys, you see some white guys, you see a couple black guys. right? They're all on the road crew together. And so between paving and pulling up stuff and doing all the stuff they have to do, what do you think they're talking about? They're talking about sports, they're talking about women, and they're talking about the man having his boot on their neck. And so where is the Democratic Party in getting at that third thing about the man having his boot on their neck and how it is that they're going to be able to provide for their family, have a little dignity, take a vacation, do all the whatever the things are they want to do. And instead, we're talking to them in many cases about things that really aren't relevant to those three things that I was just talking about.
Well, it's not lost on me that we are having a conversation about men with the two men here at the table. So I'm going to jump in for a second now, guys, and say I totally understand and agree with what you're saying about the populist economic value of work and dignity message. I actually think that the mistake the Democratic Party had made is including women, but making the male message more about an intellectual economic, right? So women now get it's so hard, right? Work is so hard, balancing family, all of this, and the system isn't giving you the support that you need. It's not respecting your work. You're not getting paid what you should be getting paid. Women get that populist message, but Democrats still do that college-educated elite economic messaging when they think of broad male categories or just broad categories in general. And so I want to posit this, Chuck.
Mm-hmm.
The decline, we saw with the Teamsters Union a big disconnect, even though Biden-Harris administration bailed out their pension fund. The Teamsters didn't come together with an endorsement, mostly because the head of the Teamsters, likes Trump personally, and the rank and file were like, this is not going to work. The rank and file question, there is a much younger demographic for unions now, and the message that unions give about making sure that you can do collective bargaining, you can protect your rights, considering the fact that young people, which is essentially anybody under the age of 40, don't got a pension, don't got any work guarantees, gig economy, you're working 3 jobs to make the one salary that you used to, you ain't getting any time paid off. Like, that is a pro-union young person messaging and reigniting that whole thing in a way that crosses demographic lines.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that's why you see now.
You can agree again. You can agree again.
That you got to have.
I find it to be a helpful way of life to agree. With the era.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yes.
I am not that stupid. I've been married for 45 days. I have to tell you, I can understand this to the T. But the important thing here is I think that if we take a step back and think about both of these demographics, younger men and women, unions are more popular than they've ever been, exactly because of what you just described. And to what you just said, Brother Jamal, is that folks feel like they have their boot on their neck. That's all 4 of these things, if you think about it. Mm-hmm. But it goes back to something you just said that I thought, let me say it again, it was one of the most brilliant things you said, which was we overcomplicate the messaging. Mm-hmm. The thing that really has gotten to me in this modern campaign world, and I've gotten to see the evolution of campaigns, I think makes me a good consultant of when I had a beeper and had a clipboard with paper on it to go talk to people. There were no cell phones. I did my homework on a world book before the internet. That makes me have a different vision of what campaigns are. Now we micro target down and we model and index people based off of what other people are, which is not a bad idea. Technology is not bad. I could say a lot of things about AI, but if just on the data piece, we've eliminated people that we talk to because we want to make campaigns efficient as they can be for return on investment for donors that demand that, to be honest. And then we also lay over models of it makes it easier to talk to. For those of you at home, there are 2 big models in Democratic politics, which is a persuasion model. What's the likelihood to persuade somebody D or R? And then there's a turnout model based off of how many times you voted. And they take your voter file that's I've got my hands up, but like say 1 to 100, and they reduce it down to just people that have the likelihood to be persuadable or democratic. And then they put a turnout score where if you haven't voted in an election, they'll never talk to you. If you voted in 1 or 2 elections, they probably won't talk to you. So that's where we lose all of this long-term communication to folks until you get married, you buy a house, and you think politics matters, and you start voting on your own. Then you go into the system. Let's stop talking right there and think what I led with. The average age of a Latino voter is 27. They age into and never hear from either party until they get to this age. So there's such a big swath of the electorate who never get talked to because they're not a persuadable or likely voter. And it's just bigger margins for them just because they happen to be younger.
Yeah, listen, this is a challenge for the entire democratic and progressive movement about how do we capture this and how do we tap into this sort of aspirational this idea that people have about what they want to do for their lives. Listen, and I think one of the most brilliant things that the Republicans did, was dastardly brilliant, right? It's evilly brilliant, is card check. When the Republicans took the union ability to get dues from every member in the worksite, and then said you had to voluntarily sign up as a union member in order to have your dues go to the union. That was a huge block on union power inside the Democratic Party. And what does that mean? Right. So I'm an entrepreneurial guy, right? I come from a union family, but I'm an entrepreneurial guy. I believe in the power of business and power markets. I also know you got to have a balance. And so what happened is the unions always kept, I'm from Detroit. We were UAW members in my family. The unions always kept the Democratic Party tethered to the economic outcomes for voters. It was great to have these big social ideas, but they also had to have economic outcomes. And I think when you defunded unions, you really took them away as the economic backbone of the Democratic Party. And the party just started having to raise all of its money from Silicon Valley and from lawyers and from all the money people. And I think that gets to what you're talking about, Chuck, in terms of talking to the people who are, the bigwigs in the country and not being rooted necessarily in the working class.
But the dastardly irony, of course, is that you have all of the tech Silicon Valley bros right now doing the Trump JD Vance circuit, but using a very populist economic message. I'm like, how are they pulling this off with any credibility? And I would say maybe they're not pulling it off with any credibility because the margins are really tight. And we're talking about 3 to 4% difference, which is the margin of error for every poll, all the data. So yeah, Chuck, take it home for us. What do we do here?
It's so, to hear both of you say this is the root of the real problem here, is that in the 90s and the early 2000s, there's only so many rich white folks you can find to vote, and they're voting at pretty high margins. So there's a cap on what a Republican do. So this was the most dastardly, let's keep doing the word dastardly, thing that they could do, which was we let them steal the reason I became a Democrat. And so they started talking like they cared about working people. They don't. But it was just something to win back a lot of these poor, non-college educated folks that are trying to make ends meet, working those 3 jobs that you talked about earlier, raising a couple kids, and just feel like your government, to Jamal's point, has got your foot on your neck and don't care about you. And then you have these crypto bros, and Donald Trump emerges with Make America Great, Drain the Swamp, and it sounds right. I'm telling everybody here that I worked for Dick Gephardt in 2004, and I helped run his presidential campaign, and him and a guy named David Bonnier and these old Democrats who were the stalwart of the UAW, stalwart of the steelworkers, who fought against NAFTA. NAFTA was passed by Bill Clinton, but was wrote by George Bush and passed by Republicans in Congress. And every rich person in Congress has always voted for free trade, while workers and worker representatives, 95% of them Democrats, have fought for workers. We as a party have gotten way too fancy and too cute +2 to bring a policy book to a knife fight. Mm-hmm. People want to hear in broad terms, what are you going to do to help me and help me immediately? Politicians have been lying to us our whole life, and I haven't gotten any better. My economic output hadn't gotten any better. And so what are you doing? And then here comes the Republicans and Donald Trump are like, we have a cap. How do we expand that cap? Well, let's start acting like we actually care about things like corporations making too much money, which is horseshit. But we allow them as Democrats, because we've forgotten how to fight the old-fashioned way, and let them own this space without taking them on to call bullshit.
All right, Chuck, I got to ask you, as the Latino Vote podcast host, I got to ask you, what's your prediction? Make us a prediction. What's going to happen on Election Day with Latino Vote?
Latino Vote is going to look pretty historically like it was with Joe Biden 4 years ago. But that is, I'll remind everybody, less than where it was 4 years prior to that. There was, I think, stuff put out by Pew, that stuff being polls, where it shows a decline since Barack Obama in support for Democrats from the Latino vote. And it's slowly gotten better for Republicans. And that's because as we started this podcast, you see an electorate maturing, and then you see anomalies like Trump compared to an anomaly, which was Barack Obama. Both super popular, well-known. Folks did not have to get paid advertising to know who they were or kind of what they stood for. You knew Barack Obama was hope and change, and you know Donald Trump, as crazy he is, wants to disrupt the system. Much of that's at the beset of democracy and other things. But you take those two things out, and I'll answer your question and shut up, is that we're going to be pretty close to where we were with Biden. The one thing that I've seen, and I'm working in 27 House races and 3 Senate races right now, is that you've seen a rebound of not only the general vote, but a big rebound of Latino voters, mainly Latinas. Thank God, women saving our ass again. Come back to win Harris having the support almost at where she was for Biden, but it will get there by election day because those numbers continue to move in the right direction in weekly trackers.
So what I heard
and
from
did we win the House? I heard you said 27 House races. Do we win the House, Democrats?
Yeah, we'll win the House by 4 or 5. Maybe on a good night, we'll win by 8.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
What I'm hearing from this is that there's a lot of discussion that needs to still happen about men, but ultimately women are going to come in and save the day. That's
every time,
right? Okay.
Every time.
Just wanted to make sure we all understood.
Listen,
from my lips to God's ears.
From the cause.
That's how it works in my house. My wife is always saving the day.
I love having brothers. I I grew up as the only daughter in a family of brothers, and now I've got you guys too here to. So
now you got 2 more brothers.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So we're going to keep this going. Chuck, thank you so much for joining us and getting really nerdy and data with us, which I think is so helpful when we take it away from what we see on cable television and understand how people actually get connected to politics.
For the next podcast, and before we go out, I'm always remiss to say that the biggest problem, single problem in all of our politics is that I look at these 3 beautiful faces on this podcast, and this is not what the hierarchy of Democratic consultants or the managerial parts of campaigns look like.
Amen.
At the presidential level, Julie Chavez Rodriguez is doing an amazing job. But at this House and Senate level, the party committees and the super PACs are doing an excellent job now. But when you get to the candidate level, there's not a Black person, there's not a Latino, there's not a multicultural person of any sorts managing any of these races or making any strategic decisions on those races at the ground level. And that's where we fundamentally need to change and disrupt the system.
All right. Amen. We heard it from your mouth to God's ears.
Boom.
Thanks for being on Trailblaze.